Introduce our speaker, Zara Faris. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I greet you all with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And good evening, and thank you so much to everybody for coming down here tonight. It has been a beautiful day outside, so thank you for capping it with gathering here in this session, and I hope there's something that we can all gain from this evening in our discussion. Now, I've been asked to talk about empowering women in the context of two different approaches, Islam and feminism. Now, just before I begin, I would like to preamble this with the fact that because this is about discovering Islam, and there will be some discussion on feminism, I am going to spend a little bit more time on talking about Islam so that you can understand about that, but making important comparisons between the two. And also, because the title is a question, and we don't have a feminist on the panel to defend feminism or to speak for feminism, it's not fair to criticize too much. Although I will present the case for my position, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion with the audience as well. Now, to begin, as Muslims, we believe that Islam provides the solution to all human problems, and we believe that God asks us as Muslims to be problem solvers using these solutions. So God says, for example, in the Quran and in the Hadith, which are the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him. So we learn from these some angles and some approaches in which we are told that Muslims are expected to be problem solvers. One of those is that, for example, even something as simple as removing an obstacle from a road constitutes in Islam an act of charity, because it means it's a problem solved for the next person that comes along. Similarly, something as small as lifting someone's mood by smiling is also considered an act of charity in Islam, because again, it's considered something, although it might seem a small problem solved, but a problem solved nonetheless for somebody else. On a more grander scale, we're commanded to find cures for sicknesses. In other words, to study medicine and advance the study of cure and healing. We're ordered to try to alleviate the plights of others, whether that be through the economic system or the social structure of society, to make sure that we are able to help others that are in need, whatever their position may be. So as Muslims, we are given the duty of, and we are hopefully, or we aim to be rewarded for, solving problems. So in this vein, the Quran demands or commands us rather to call to what is right and to discourage and call against what is wrong and what is harmful. So we are meant to be advisors and problem solvers, and that is the service of Muslims to everybody, regardless of our gender, regardless of whether we are male, female, whichever culture we're from, whichever race we are from. As Muslims, this is the baseline duty for all of us. But what are some of the problems we're facing today? To tie this into where we're going with this discussion, well, you have global poverty, injustice, all kinds of exploitation, oppression, violence, neo-slavery, neo-colonialism, pollution, climate change, simultaneous epidemics of starvation and obesity, lack of healthcare for all, hatred, intolerance. The list is pretty much endless. It's endless, but it's definitely not new. These things are not new in our society. And all of these problems, all of these, these issues that we're facing, all of them in some way or other involve either the ignorance, the denial, or the exploitation of rights of some kind. Whether that is the rights of a person, a group of people, as in whether that is the rights of creation, or, as Muslims understand it, and as I'll come to explain, whether that even includes the rights of the creator. So all of these things involve some kind of negligence, denial, or exploitation of rights. But what are rights? If we're talking about also empowerment, we usually think of rights. If we're talking about changing societies and changing things from bad to better, we usually think of this in terms of rights. But what are rights? Because different kinds of rights are not only invoked by virtually every different group and movement that is jostling for its own territory today, but we actually often find people proposing conflicting ideas about what these rights should be, hence why you have different groups calling for their rights rather than one collective group calling for their rights. So with these conflicting ideas that society holds about what rights should be, including amongst feminists or non-feminists or different groups of people, how are we supposed to filter through these claims to rights, and how are we supposed to discern which rights are right and which rights are not? So which rights should society adopt, and where do the other rights come from? How do we even concoct them? And I feel, and I hope that this will give everybody a good basis in this discussion, a good foundation in understanding both of these approaches behind me. Now, whilst the focus of this discussion is women and the position of women and the rights of women, to ask the question what defines rights, we do of course have to take gender out of the equation, because rights in of itself is not specific to any gender. So we're going to ask what defines rights, regardless of who they relate to. What is the basis or justification for that in the first place? Now, what are the potential theories about rights to answer this? Now, there are really only a few possible sources of where human beings can determine what their rights ought to be. And there are only a few possible sources from which over time we have seen throughout history that many have actually considered some of these possibilities and tried to build systems out of them, often in a trial and error sort of basis, because they're figuring it out as they go along. Now, these possibilities include: one, nature being a source of determining rights. I will explain each and every one of these, so don't worry. Now, the first possibility is that nature is a source of rights. The second possibility is that man or woman, as in the human mind, or the human being in of themselves being the source to determine what these rights are. The third are concepts of pain and pleasure as a source to determine what rights are, which really also falls into the second category of humankind deciding what they are. And of course, the final possibility is God, or the creator, or a transcendent being as the source to determine rights. So let's start with the possibility of nature being the source of rights. Now, this is the idea that nature can actually tell us what our rights are, and in the past, some have said that the divine will, the will of God, can be derived or understood simply by observing nature. This was what was claimed under this theory. And that as a result, the claim was that nature itself is revelation. And according to this theory, therefore, men have a natural right to subsist, to do as they please, and to pursue objects of sustenance and utility. This was all derived by certain individuals when they thought that nature was the source of understanding rights. So, in other words, according to nature, men had a right, I say men, the theory means humans, right? That people had a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of material objects. Now, interestingly, the pursuit of material objects was later changed to happiness, which tells us something about our approach to the material world, and this later became known as life, liberty, and happiness. And some people call this the natural rights theory. Now, let's query this. As a source of determining rights, we see that when we look close, this is actually flawed and a little absurd. So, for example, consider the natural right to life, which is being claimed. Now, would this be respected? Would nature respect a person's natural right to life if they were, for example, stranded alone on a desert island, or caught in a tsunami, or on a ship caught at sea? They are then amongst nature, but nature does not actually respect the human right, or a natural right to life. Similarly, if natural tendencies are the source from which we are supposed to understand our rights, then what about people that have a natural tendency, or whether it is learned or whatever it may be, an inherent tendency towards either lying or violence? Would we then say that those tendencies towards lying or violence should give right to be untruthful or to be violent? Of course, we would never advocate this. Now, similarly, the philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill observed some of these criticisms. They observed some of these problems. with nature being the source of determining rights. And Bentham even described this theory as nonsense on stilts. So they went through this phase where they took this as a possibility, and then they decided, no, this is nonsense, this doesn't work. So they came up with a different theory. And they basically argued that happiness should determine what rights people should have. And in particular, Bentham and Mill claimed that rights should be determined depending on what gave rise to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And many of you would know this as utilitarianism. And as a source of determining rights, we see that this is also very flawed. It doesn't make sense, it's not a good source. And it's just as absurd. And the reasons are because, first, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or the greatest aggregate happiness, as the aggregate term is part of this, it actually gives rise to the possibility or the necessity of breaching some quantity of important rights. It necessitates committing some quantity of injustice for the purpose of inducing a greater good or greater justice. Because if you're saying the greatest happiness, then there is still a minority where you're saying, well, I'm sorry, you have to be, unhappy. This is basically, to boil it down, what it's saying. The second problem is, it relies on fallible human beings. It relies on fallible human beings to effectively predict what is conducive to the greater good. The third problem is that it leaves blank. It's like a blank check as to whose rights are to be made central to the argument. And it doesn't specify where the balance pivots on the happiness or the number. And so under this theory, a lot of injustice can and has actually been justified and can continue to be so by some obscure appeal to a future good, to a future greater good. And it can also actually lead to different conclusions depending on the context in which it's stated. So for example, some have used this same argument, this utilitarian argument, to claim that pornography should not be banned even though it harmed some people, because by and large it gave, or because it harmed some women or men, because by and large they claimed it gave happiness to a greater number of people. And on the other hand, there were another group that argued in the reverse, to say that it has to be banned because although it brought pleasure to a small number of people, it actually brought a greater harm to a larger number of people. So effectively, this leaves the reality that under this theory, your rights would be sourced from a state or a condition that only considers convenience. And it is basically a blank check as to who has the upper hand in that scenario. Now, another theory which comes and follows on from this is the idea of doing unto others as you would have done unto you. Treat others as you would like to be treated. This is another one that falls into the category of man-made theories about how rights should be determined. So the idea is known as the theological ontologicalism of Kant, if anybody wants to know that, but basically treat others as you would like to be treated. And the reality, again, is of course that as a source of rights, this doesn't work. Because as we know from our daily interactions, different people differ as to how they would like to be treated. You don't even have to look at this on a state level. You can even witness this on an interpersonal level. Different people have different preferences as to how they would like to be treated. And to be a little, cutting about it, what about sadomasochists? They definitely have a different preference to other people in society. So it's not only how they would like to be treated, but what rules they would like to have universal on everybody else. So, for example, it doesn't solve the problem related to free speech. So, in the great freedom of speech debate, you have some people arguing that, I'm okay with absolute free speech, I'm okay with gratuitous insult, I'm okay with libel, rumors, it's fine, it doesn't bother me, so it shouldn't bother you. Whereas on the other hand, you have people saying, no, we need to have measured freedom of speech, we need to have limits, we need to have libel and slander laws, we need to have these protections in place. So that's just one example of how when people have differences of what they prefer, it doesn't unknot these problems in society, rather it amplifies them. Now, also in this category is the idea that might makes right, and you see this in lots of different permutations. So, in other words, it's the idea that the state is the source of rights because the state is supposed to express the will of the majority of men and women. And this is known as positivism, or the democratization of rights. Now, even if the state did express the will of the majority of men and women, this theory, again, could just as easily be used, and it has been used, to support existing hierarchies of power and maintaining structures of their dominance in society. So what I mean by this is that many, including feminists, have noted the problem with this theory. And I'm going to quote Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dawkins, who made this observation, who are feminist thinkers and writers. And they said, those who have power over others tend to call their own power rights. So if someone has power in society, oftentimes they disguise it as a right. And the quote continues, when those they dominate want equality, i.e. with them, then the ones in power say no. They say basically no. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but they say no, important rights will be violated if society changes. The law protects rights, but mostly it protects the rights of those who have power. So this is an observation made about the whole might is right principle, and it has been noted by lots of different groups in society. Now, an example of this in action is when white supremacists in certain parts of the world where they experienced segregation between black and white people, and white supremacists used rights, or they claimed to use rights, such as the right to association. So they claimed that they had the right to associate with whom they wanted, and whom they wanted to associate with was only other white people. And so they used this right to argue against the need to integrate. And when they were forced to integrate, this was one thinker phrased this as follows: when they were forced to integrate, the whites technically lost the power to exclude blacks. This they experienced as having lost the right to associate with whom they wanted, that is to say, exclusively with other white people. So in other words, it's often the powerful groups in society, the ones that already have power, who succeed in using rights in this way to protect the advantages that they have. In fact, if you consider the views of racists or fascists or any kind of bigotry, according to these theories, which are, by the way, under these theories, they cannot actually be locked out by criminal or civil law if they're voted in by the majority. If the majority votes in discriminatory rights, that's it. That is the way that it is, unless they are discredited by society's disgust, outrage, or ridicule. That's usually the way pressures move. Now, one example of a system of rights that actually identifies a very important key in our discussion today is the idea of human rights. And when we look at human rights, we come across a problem, and then we find a solution from it, actually, that helps us to understand this question. Now, human rights is, in a nutshell, the idea that we are owed rights by virtue of being human. In a nutshell, being human means that you are owed certain rights. So, for example, it's proposed that humans have an inalienable right to freedom, simply by virtue of being human. So if you're human, you have a right to freedom to go about and do, and act freely. But if simply being human, if being human is the criteria for the right to freedom, then we have to ask, why do we lock up criminals? I'm not complaining, I'm just asking, what is the reason that we lock criminals up? They're still human after all, but we choose to deprive them of their right to freedom. Why is that? They're still human. The idea is therefore inconsistent, and the reality is that we decide that that right is no longer deserved. So then we understand that actually rights tend to be based on what people deserve. And how we understand what people deserve is the next question. Now, for Muslims, what is deserved depends upon purpose. In fact, I would argue for all people, we understand our purpose, and what is deserved depends upon our purpose. And I'll explain what I mean by this. For Muslims, only the creator of creation, of us, can be the source from which we understand our purpose, the reason for our existence in the first place. So we can see that nature as a source of rights doesn't make sense, and many of the man-made philosophies and approaches that we looked at didn't make sense, because if it's man-made, and just to share a very interesting quote, which I hope will stay with you, not just in this talk, but afterwards as well, that if it's man-made, essentially the point is that it is really just down to someone's imagination. a group of people or one person or a few people, someone's very fickle and mercurial and fallible mind, or their personal musings. And one thinker, Ronald Dworkin, described this as follows, and I think it's very succinct. He said, the institution of rights requires an act of faith on the part of minorities because the scope of their rights will be controversial whenever they are important, and because the officers of the majority will act on their own notions of what these rights really are. In other words, even though there's some kind of promise that, oh, the rights of the minority will be considered, ultimately the minority has to rely on the good faith of those in power to actually exercise their rights. You almost have to supplicate or beseech or protest or lobby for these things. So rights under these theories only exist when humans say they exist. It's a bit like monopoly money or even real money. We all agree that this piece of paper represents £20. We just agree this. Similarly, rights under these theories only exist when everybody plays along. So, does this sound like a good source on which we should rely on rights, these man-made philosophies? It sounds like something that is very fickle and very mercurial and something that is very conditional on too many factors. So, everything has, coming back to purpose, which I mentioned because that's where we landed, everything in existence has a particular purpose, and the purpose is determined by the intention of the person that brought it about. So if a person invented a car, he invented that car for the purpose of getting a person from A to B to C to D or whatever, to take that person, to be able to transport that person. And they created a very particular manual for that particular model of car. It's not for any other car, it's for that particular model of car. And that manual contains everything the car needs. Oh, this car takes, this fuel, this car needs this car needs that, this much air in the tires, this much oil, this type of whatever. Everything is specified in that manual. Similarly, with human beings, humans were created with a specific purpose. And for Muslims, we understand that God created us with a specific purpose, which was to worship God, and with a particular manual. And I'll explain a little bit more about this shortly. But essentially, it is the purpose itself that gives rise to the rights which are owed to people. It is the purpose that it all depends on. Without purpose, there's no existence, and without existence, there is no purpose. So how do Muslims go about then addressing the issue of actually establishing rights, understanding what these rights are, and establishing them in society? And I'd like to point out that with particular regard to Muslim women, the rights of Muslim women have more recently been very drastically eroded and hidden away behind post-colonial culture and modern ideologies. And that is what has caused us to ask this question today, not just about the empowerment of women, but we're asking very specifically about Islam. And usually this question arises because of a lot of discussion or observation or even misconceptions about the state of Muslim women around the world or wherever. And I say erosion, and by way of example, to show that this wasn't always the case, there is a very brief, there was a travel writer as late as the 18th century. So I'm not talking about 7th century Islam, I'm not talking about 8th century Islam, I'm not talking about 14, 15, 1300 years ago. I'm talking about the 18th century. One English travel writer, a female English travel writer, who traveled in the Muslim world, in particular the Ottoman Caliphate, and she had access not only to the public areas, but also the women's private areas, because she was a woman, unlike the male travel writers who would not have had that access. She said as follows: as to women, as many, if not more than men, are to be seen in the streets, i.e. going about their daily activities. I think I never saw a country where women may enjoy so much liberty and free from all reproach as in Turkey. The Turks, in their conduct towards our agenda, are an example to all other nations. By Turks, she means the Muslims, because that's where she's traveling. And I repeat it, sir, I think no women have so much liberty, safe from apprehension, as the Turkish, and I think them in their manner of living capable of being the happiest creatures breathing. So this was her observation of Muslim women in the 18th century. So this is during the advent of Western feminism, of kind of around the time when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And already in the Muslim world, this was the condition of Muslim women. There are many, many quotes. This is just one of them. Now, if we compare that with today, which everybody in this room probably has some access or familiarity with, media and all this that is out there, in a Muslim society today, any lack of implementation of women's rights actually serves as a glaring piece of evidence that society overall is not actually functioning on Islamic principles. And the lack of rights for women is actually the symptom of a much deeper problem that actually pervades all other aspects of society. And this is really important for this discussion, and I hope you'll see why as I continue. Now, we don't have time to obviously do a really detailed diagnosis of the condition of the Muslim world in this short session, but by way of summary, I will say this to help you out, if anybody that isn't familiar with this already. Now, the Muslim world at the moment is exhibiting, and I say the Muslim world as a generic, but I mean, you know what I mean by that, the countries which are majority Muslim and that have had an Islamic past and a Muslim history. Now, the majority of that is presently exhibiting the trauma of post-colonialism, and one of the things that happened during colonialism was essentially the amputation of Islam from the education system. And what that means is, before, the education system at all levels included in-depth study of Islam, from its law to its structures, its jurisprudence, its theology, its basic principles, its language, Arabic. All of this was a core part of education, along with languages, maths, geometry. Of course, we know, if you haven't heard already, there is a lot of contribution of Muslims to science. You'll be having a talk on that later in the week, I think. So this was in addition to that, and all of that was composite. It was all part and parcel of the education. Now, one of the effects or the acts of colonialism was to separate that and to effectively secularize the education, so that the study of Islam, of this rich and dynamic legal system, of this social system, actually the understanding of that ended up becoming more and more shallow and removed from practical application and from practical use. And what this did was it gave rise to injustices, not only against women, but against men, because it ended up in more corruption, in more tyranny, and it ended up with power being the currency in society, where power and reputation is more important than principle. So society no longer functioned on principle, but on power and what you could get, more like each man for himself. And this shallow thinking actually ended up with some people, rather than, as is the tradition in Islam, to understand the Islamic text and the law and to apply jurisprudence to new situations, instead they would simply recycle or imitate the way that things had been done before, rather than legitimately exercise new legal reasoning with new problems. And what this means is that the current legal state doesn't reflect properly upon how it should be, and it doesn't reflect and match up with dealing with the problems in society. And not only did it lead to this shallow thinking, but often the people of these, some people, not all of them, but some people end up emulating and copying the ways of life of their former colonizers, and in particular the ideology that they were exposed to, which was secular liberalism. Now, Muslims of the post-colonial era, they often held that their cultures or practices, for any Muslims or anyone from the Asian subcontinent or from the Arab backgrounds or wherever, or maybe even anybody might recognize this from their parents if you are second generation, but they often held that their culture or practices of any of the ideologies or movements that they were part of, so for example, whether it was Arab nationalism, Arab national socialism, communism, or the Indian subcontinent, which was mixed with a lot of Victorian British ideals, as well as baggage from Indian culture, they often felt that all of these, or they tried to argue that all of these were compatible with Islam. They tried to argue that if it wasn't compatible, that it actually came from Islam itself. So this is how we end up, for example, in East Africa, with some Muslims believing that their practice of female circumcision, which actually dates back to ancient Egypt, and was also practiced by their Christian and animist neighbors, but they erroneously believed that this was from Islam itself. This is just an example of how people absorb the cultures around them and then believe it comes from their religion and try to emphasize it as being from their religion because they face the same pressures to uphold these cultures. Now, in such cases, people could have been ignorant about Islam, or they assimilated these practices. And similarly, today, Muslims are facing a similar, or you may witness Islam experiencing a similar challenge. So just with different cultures and practices. So it may not be those things, but it's different cultures and practices that we are experiencing, competing worldviews and some of this absorption. Now, today the cultural landscape is, again, different to ideologies of the past, but Muslims still, in the absence of a righteous Islamic government, are conflicted. And instead of a collision of cultures, which people often talk about, that, there is a collision of cultures, in fact, there is not a collision, but Muslims are actually being pulled in the direction of different competing values, just the same as any people would do if they were set and placed amongst a lot of different competing cultures and societies. The result is you end up pulled in a lot of different directions. Now, the reality is that for Muslims, regardless of time and place, regardless of which culture or land or which time period you are from, we're directed by God in the Holy Quran not to compete with each other based on cultures. Cultures are supposed to enrich us, and we are supposed to identify each other and enjoy our cultures by all means and celebrate our cultures, but we are not meant to, and we are not allowed to compete based on culture. Instead, we are told to compete in attaining righteousness. And this is something that both men and women are told to compete in, attaining righteousness. There's no other factor. It's attaining righteousness. So we find in the Quran, God says, "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into peoples and tribes, that you may know one another. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you." And this righteousness for Muslims is defined very clearly by Islam itself, not by any culture. And this actually obliterates any allegiance other than to Islam. Now, feminism too is a cultural influence. It's a cultural influence that is currently relevant. It may not be Arab socialism or nationalism or communism, but feminism is a cultural influence that is currently relevant because it happens to be significant right now in the UK, in the States, in secular liberal societies, in the West and in other parts of the world as well, in different formulations. And it also has influence in westernized parts of the Muslim world. So it's not uncommon to hear feminism being invoked as a remedy to some of the problems that women face. It's not uncommon to hear this. Now, unfortunately, a great deal of confusion and misunderstanding is actually generated when we imagine that feminism is the only way to visualize and actualize women's rights. And when we imagine that feminism is entirely synonymous with women's rights, that they are interchangeable terms. And then when we try to amalgamate as different worldviews, when we try to amalgamate feminism with another worldview such as Islam, it ends up with a lot of confusion. And this conflation, or saying that feminism and women's rights are interchangeable terms, they're one and the same thing, is in of itself a problem that we need to resolve. And what's interesting is that in the UK today, there was a study done by the Fawcett Society. For anyone not aware, that's one of the leading feminist societies in the UK. They did a study a couple of years ago, and they found that only 7 to 9% of women actually identify as feminists, even though the majorities of men and women that they themselves interviewed and found their findings, the majorities of men and women actually believe, they claim to believe, in gender equality. They believe in gender equality, but they don't identify as feminists. Only 7% of women chose to identify as feminists. Now this shows that feminists, or feminism itself, doesn't actually wield a monopoly on the concept of or the liberal idea of equality. It doesn't actually hold a monopoly, it doesn't hold a sole, it doesn't have exclusivity on women's rights. We can talk about women's rights without necessarily having to talk about feminism. We can be advocates of women's rights without necessarily having to call ourselves feminists, and many people do. And those who do identify as feminists are just one group amongst many throughout different cultures and time periods whose work deals with women's rights. Now, another way to explain this point is that feminism is to women's rights what capitalism and communism are to economics. So economics, in other words, is about the distribution of resources, right? Economics is about the distribution of resources, and capitalism and communism each have their own approaches on resource distribution. They are not economics themselves, they have approaches to economics. These are economic systems, but they are not economics. Similarly, feminism is just one approach to the matter of women's rights, and other worldviews have different approaches. Islam has another approach to women's rights. Now, currently, with specific regards to feminism, because that's one of the approaches that we're talking about today, Western culture and civilization, or secular liberal culture and civilization, is largely based on the idea of individualism. And individualism makes the assumption that humans are mainly individuals with no purpose except to exist as individuals. Being the individual is more important than anything else. However, humans, like cells in the body, aren't merely individuals. Humans are social creatures. We're defined involuntarily to some extent by society, by culture, by our parents, by our genetics, by the languages we're taught. We're very much defined by the languages we're taught, and we don't even get a say in the first language we're taught. We can't learn language without being taught by another person. That's how dependent we are on other human beings. That's how non-individual we all actually are. If anybody has actually looked into or studied the phenomenon of feral children, you'll see that at some point, if children don't learn to speak, they don't have human interaction to learn to speak by the age of maybe 5 or 6 or something like that, they will never, ever, ever learn the skills, the motor skills to be able to speak. That's how dependent we are on other people in our infancy, at a period where we don't have the ability to do things for ourselves. So this is how non-individual we are. We're creatures that have so many instinctive needs that can only actually be fulfilled by other people. And this is why solitary confinement, for example, is actually considered one of the most inhumane punishments. To cut somebody off from other people, even if they're other prisoners, it's considered to be one of the worst punishments that you could give to somebody, to shut them away, solitary confinement. Now, humans were created in the universe, and we came into the universe with our nature, with our genetics. We weren't responsible for creating the universe. We didn't create our nature, we didn't create our genetics. And humans are mostly passive recipients of all of these realities. And you can't really escape those by and large. The more social things you can filter out and decide, but these realities actually come or reflect or show that there is a higher truth that we are part of. And individualism's claim to actually put the person above these realities is usually what it calls liberation. So to say that a person does not have to obey religious commandments, a person does not have to obey, certain things in society because you're an individual, you should be able to do whatever you want. This is, or to a certain in a certain manner, this is what it calls liberation, and actually it's one of its biggest illusions, because ultimately it ends up disconnecting humans from that higher reality, from that higher purpose. And it leaves them vulnerable to the oppression of whoever happens to have most power in society. That is what happens. Now, one example to explain this is the idea that, this idea that our conceptions and rights are determined by our Creator, is the question of who owns your human body. Now, I'm not talking about from a legal perspective specifically, I'm just talking about who owns your human body. And one of the key messages that is commonly either in a subtle way or an overt way that is perpetuated, particularly to women, or just to people generally, is that your body is yours. You can do with it whatever you want. You can dress it or undress it however you want, regardless of the circumstances, on the basis that, doesn't matter what I'm saying, but on the basis that your body belongs to you. This is the argument. This is not only touted by fashion designers who want you to buy things, but also by some feminist groups as well that uphold, sex-positive feminism, for example. And what they are upholding is one of the underlying fundamentals of liberal feminism, which is the idea of ownership over one's body. Now, For secular liberal feminists, the idea that a woman should practice modesty, for example, or a Muslim woman should practice modesty, or that society can be a reason or pressure you or be any factor in your consideration for how you dress, actually implies that your body does not belong to you. This is the claim that is often made. Your body is yours, you should be able to do whatever you want with it. And they have long complained, such secular liberal feminists have long complained that the female, and there's going to be some terminology here, so do stay with me, but they argue that the female has been regarded as enmeshed in her bodily existence in a way that makes the attainment of rationality questionable. What they mean by that is that women, unlike men, are perceived as being bodies instead of being rational beings that happen to have bodies. This is the idea, and they call this concept enmeshment or embodiment. And according to these feminists, they seek to argue, I am not my body, I own my body, and society or men's ideas do not own my body. Now the question is, how exactly do any of us, men or women, how do we own our own bodies? For example, if ownership is control, then neither men nor women actually own their own bodies. Did we give birth to ourselves? Did we make ourselves? Did we decide our natural size and shape? We didn't. If ownership is maintenance, then can we actually survive without depending on other bodies, on other people, either as an individual or as a human race? Can we actually survive without depending on others, either trading with us or looking after us when we're young or looking after us when we're older or when we're sick? Can we actually survive? Are we independent of that? Are we independent of our environment and the need for social interaction, for our continued existence and even mental well-being? Now, Islam recognizes that we do not, neither men nor women, we do not own our own bodies, and therefore we don't have a complete blanket right to decide what we do with our bodies, whether that's to do with how we dress, whether that's to do with how we act in society, whether that's to do with anything. Instead of ownership, we are actually taught that we are entrusted with our bodies. So our bodies are a trust. In Arabic, this is known as amana. So we have a responsibility towards our bodies and also with our bodies. What we do in society, we will be accountable for because we've been given, limbs and a physical state and the ability to do things. We'll be accountable for all of that, and therefore it's considered something that you're entrusted with. And we also have rights and duties towards each other with those. Now, simply speaking, as a comparison, feminism as an ideology makes the female individual, rather than the male individual, the judge or the arbiter in working out what is good for women in society. And Islam, on the other hand, doesn't make either men or women the judge or the arbiter, but actually makes God the judge or the arbiter, and it makes men and women the agents of that. So we have a duty to fulfill and to satisfy what the judge has said about how we should be interacting with each other. Now, for Muslims, it was God. It was God, not any man-made theories, not humans. It wasn't Mill or Bentham or any Ahmed or Iqbal. It wasn't any humans that came up with these rights. But for Muslims, it was God that decided that a woman's deeds would be judged no differently than a man's deeds in terms of good conduct, truthfulness, patience, charity, fasting, repentance, inviting to what is good and forbidding of what is bad, her use of knowledge. So, for example, not only as having a duty to obtain knowledge, but as a political player in society, or as somebody that is, active in society. It was God, not humans, that stated in the Quran, I do not waste the deed of any doer among you, be they male or female. The one of you is as the other. It was God that stated that. Women didn't have to campaign and lobby with placards for generations and generations for this. For us, it was God that has said this. Our duty is to make sure that these principles and these and some of the rules that I'll go into, that they are implemented. Not that as a basis they are even agreed upon. We don't have to even argue about that. It was God, not humans, that decided there will be no difference between a man's worship and a woman's worship. So in Islam, a woman is an independent entity, like a man, and a fully accountable human being, like a man. Her acceptance of Islam is only of her own original and independent will. It's not by proxy through her father, her husband, or anyone else. So if you see a woman that starts to wear the hijab, don't automatically assume that her father, her husband, or anyone else has told her to do so. It's quite possible she has an independent and free will in doing that. It was God, not humans, that decided that she should have her own legal standing, that she could aspire towards any profession or vocation, and if she chose to raise children, then God decided that heaven would be under her feet. It wasn't, again, man coming up with this to promote women having babies. It wasn't women that protested for these rights. These were rights set out by God. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman had the right to be provided for financially, that nobody could control her wealth is her own, and that if she chose, if she were to provide for her family, she would actually get more reward than her husband. And it was God that decided that a woman would have rights over her husband just as he had rights over her. It was God, not humans, that ordained that she should have the right to respect, affection and time from her husband, the right to physical satisfaction by her husband, the right to shelter provided by her husband, the right to food and clothing equal in quality to her husband's, although some guys generally dress a lot worse than their wives, so maybe equality is not what we're going for with that. The right to physical protection provided by her husband, the right to a dowry. All of this was from God, not from man, not from nature, not from any of that. Now, as a result of some of these, women have often played a fundamental role. For example, the economic rights that I mentioned. Women didn't use this just to, sit on their laurels and, hoard and amass wealth. Instead, and as they continue to do today, women have often played a very fundamental role in the distribution of wealth. So while they were being provided for, they had more disposable income, more savings to do with what they want. And in the 18th century, for example, Ottoman women of all classes, not just the upper classes, not just the wealthy classes, Ottoman women of all classes actually established 20 to 30% of all the charitable foundations and trusts in society. In Arabic, this is called waqf or awqaf, as plural. So this included things like schools, hospitals, caravansaries, baths, fountains, soup kitchens, hostels, mosques. They were all financed by women from their own personal resources for the benefit of the public. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman would be obliged, just as a man was, to seek knowledge, to the extent possible for either of them, to seek an education, to advocate what is good in society and to discourage what is bad. It was God, not humans, that actually ordained that vast proportions of Islam, as we know it today, would actually be transmitted to Muslims by women. By women themselves, we have come to learn so much of what Islam is. So, for example, Aisha, radiallahu anha, who was one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, she was responsible for actually transmitting a huge corpus of the hadith, the prophetic narrations, which I mentioned earlier. And she was also a key jurist and legal thinker, which has helped to form our understanding of Islam as we know it today. In fact, women have fulfilled the work of intellectual Muslims to such an extent that the contemporary Sheikh Akram Nadwi, who is a sheikh in our time, he's documented at least 8,000 Muslim female scholars across global history, and that's only in the field of hadith sciences. Only in the fields of hadith. That doesn't include medicine, that doesn't include other forms of technology or science or anything else, only in hadith sciences, not languages, not poetry. There were many in those fields as well, but just in this area of religious knowledge and education, because people often say that it's a male-dominated religion, at least 8,000 of those that were known. At least 8,000. Now, because Islam doesn't make a discriminatory differentiation between the male and female intellect, both male and female students are actually reported, historically documented, to have congregated to learn from these female intellects. And they would often gather around her home in huge crowds and swathes, trying to get just a minute to ask her a question, because there's so many people. And these are legal questions about Islamic law, about jurisprudence, about the Arabic language that leads to that. And some notable male scholars, if anybody has familiarity, doesn't know, these are the backbones of our understanding of Islamic jurisprudence. These are some of the main individuals that we study when we want to study Islamic law. These are individuals that are known to have taken their knowledge from female scholars. Now, not only have female scholars played an undeniable and prominent and critical role in the early development of Islamic law, but Islamic courts themselves, so not just theory, but the actual practical application, historically they were so renowned for guaranteeing justice for women that during the Ottoman Caliphate, even women of other religious communities, they actually preferred to have their matters dealt with in the Islamic courts. So even though they had access to their own religious courts, they preferred to take their matters to the Qadi, to the Muslim judge, because they felt that the Muslim judge was actually more considerate of women's needs and what she would need. And they would choose, despite not being Muslim, to go to the Muslim courts to have their matters resolved. Now, whilst God provided the rights for women, and this is where we get to the problem, right? Whilst God provided these rights for women, why are they not happening? Why do we not see them right now? Now, the reality is that the rights of any person, whether it's in Islam or any system whatsoever, the rights are actually incumbent upon duties being fulfilled by other people and by structures and infrastructure in society. This is how rights are fulfilled. So, for example, the right for a Muslim woman to manage her own economic affairs and be provided for actually depends on the duty that a male relative has to provide for her. But this becomes problematic. It becomes a pipe dream in situations of poverty. If you have poverty and the man cannot get a job despite best efforts, how is he going to fulfill the woman's right to be provided for? Similarly, the right to obtain legal remedies in the event of divorce or marital discord, again, it depends on the duty of those that are in authority to actually manage people's affairs justly. And again, this becomes impossible if there is the lack of an Islamic authority or courts to hear these complaints. Again, the right to go out and seek knowledge, which we talked about. The right to go out and seek knowledge depends not only on the duty of those that have knowledge to convey what they have learned, but it also becomes hazardous if the streets are actually filled with violence or war, or are just too dangerous to go out into. Or if people are too busy scraping together a living to even think about having time to enhance themselves. And it's for this reason that most men tend to choose work and jobs, not necessarily based on what they enjoy or what their passions are, but they tend to choose jobs which they expect or hope will make most money, or which will make any money at all if they're living hand to mouth, and often in the face of corruption and tyranny. So, I'm getting to the end. Okay, all right, enjoy. There is an interconnectedness in Islam, basically, between one person's rights, regardless of their gender, and the duties of an entire community. And there is an interconnectedness not just between the genders, but there is an interconnectedness between the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the teachers and the students. And whenever God has given someone an advantage in society, we consider that he has made them all the more accountable. So where there is advantage, there is additional responsibility and additional accountability. The authority has to exist in order for the accountability to exist. If someone was not in charge of something, they can say, well, it wasn't my job. So this is why in Islam, when someone is given a role, a duty, it comes with more responsibility. And they have to be given that as a job in order for them to be accountable for it. Now, there is a parable I would like to share with you which actually explains this very nicely. But just a very brief point before that. It is very important, but power or authority, because we use the word empowerment a lot. Now, power or authority in of itself in Islam is not considered a virtue. It's not considered a virtue to seek power, and I'll explain what I mean by that, because it's considered that the one who asks for power, give me power, is the one that should actually not be given power, that should be disqualified from that position, because power is considered to be magnetic to the corruptible. So this is why sometimes when people put themselves forth for a position of power, the presumption is that if you're putting yourself forward for that, knowing what a burdensome role it is, knowing the level of accountability, then your intentions are most likely going to end up, if they're not now, but going to end up being corrupted, but rather it's usually given to someone that really doesn't want anything to do with it. I'm talking about the leader of a nation in this scenario. And by a basis, the leader of a nation intrinsically has no preference over someone that is, for example, a street sweeper. They are both equal. What matters is the sincerity with which they actually discharge their duty. Now, this mutual reliance of rights and duties, I'd like to kind of embed this in your mind with a really interesting parable. And this parable isn't actually from Islamic texts. I think it's a Vietnamese, perhaps Buddhist, I'm not sure. But it's a very interesting visualization of what we're talking about when we talk about balancing the rights and duties of people in society. So there's a wise man's tale that says that heaven and hell are identical. So it says that there's a man, he comes to the end of his life. This is not a joke, although it sounds like one. He comes to the end of his life, and he goes up to the heavens, and he meets an angel. And the angel says, okay, it's time for me to take you to either heaven or hell. Are you ready? And the man says, wait, before you take me, I would like to see both places. I would like to see both heaven and hell, just so I know, just so once in my life I've seen it. So the angel says, okay, come on, I'll show you hell first. So the angel takes this man to a room, he opens the door. Again, this is not from Islamic tradition, just to remember that. He opens his door, and the man looks inside, and there are ginormously long halls. Wonderful, beautiful dining halls, decorated with lights and tables running up and down, filled with the most delicious food you could ever imagine in your life. Every kind of cuisine, every kind of flavor, every kind of aroma, every type of style of cooking. This is hell, remember? And he looks closely because he sees that there are people sitting either side of the tables, but they don't look happy. They don't look like they're enjoying this. And so the man is really confused, and the angel says, look closely. And so the man looks, and he sees that they have chopsticks to eat with, and these chopsticks are really long. So these chopsticks are so long that by the time the people actually reach around to this delicious food and get it on to the end of their chopsticks, they then can't reach around and fit it into their own mouths. So they're all sitting there tormented by themselves because they can't actually enjoy all of this wonderful food. And this man is horrified. He thinks this is the worst thing he has ever seen, and he says, truly, this is hell. And then the angel says, okay, are you ready to see heaven? And so the man says, okay, show me heaven. And so the angel takes him to another room, opens the door. It's exactly the same. It's stunning, just as stunning as the last. There was no difference. All the food is there, wonderful as the previous, and people are sitting up and down the tables, and they're having a brilliant time. They're laughing, they're joking, they're talking, enjoying each other's company. And he looks closer and he sees that they too have the very long chopsticks. But in heaven, what they're doing is when they get the food on the end of their chopsticks, they actually reach across the table and feed each other. So in hell, everybody is tormented and tortured because they're only thinking about themselves. Whereas in heaven, everybody's needs are being fulfilled because they're actually thinking about their duty to the other in order for their needs to also be fulfilled. Now, similarly, although that depicts, the nature and the mutual dependence of rights and duties in Islam, and how I talked about, the right to be provided for depends on this and X depends on Y, this is really an illustration of that. And there is another one that I will end with this this parable. This has gone on a little bit longer than I anticipated. I'm sorry about that. The other parable is actually a narration. It's a hadith, and this is in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, said. He explained this problem, and he said, "The example of the person abiding by God's order and restrictions, in comparison to those who violate them, is like the example of people who drew their lots for their seat in a boat. Some of them got seats in the upper part and others in the lower." So to paraphrase, he's saying that in some instances in life, you may be on the upper deck in society. You may have more wealth or more intelligence or more strength or whatever advantage you may have. At the same time, in other aspects of life, you may be the person on the lower deck. So it doesn't mean that just because you're on the upper deck by way of one thing that you're permanently or only on the upper deck. But essentially, the idea is that in life, some people are on the upper deck and other people are on the lower deck. And it goes on. When those on the bottom deck needed water, they had to go up to bring water. And they felt that troubled the people on the upper deck. So they said, let's make a hole in our part of the ship and get water. So the people on the lower deck are saying, look, let's not hassle them. It's too much. Let's just get water for ourselves. Let's make a hole in the bottom, then we'll get water, and we don't have to trouble them. Now, the narration goes on, if the people in the upper part let the people in the lower part do what they had suggested, then all of the people in the ship would be destroyed. But if they prevented them, both parties would be safe. Now what that means is that the solution for the lack of rights of people on the lower deck, whether they are people of less wealth, less strength, less power, less anything, is not that everyone should get a drill for their part of the boat. That's not the solution. The solution depends, one, upon the people with advantage in society, the people on the upper deck, fulfilling their duty towards those on the lower deck, and two, it depends upon the people on the lower deck not being shy about demanding their rights from the people on the upper deck. Because if they don't do this, it's not just the people on the lower deck that are going to suffer. It's not just the people on the upper deck, it's everybody. This is the interconnectedness of people's realities in Islam. And you know, while some forms of feminism, not all, but some advocate intersectionality in diagnosing problems, in other words, looking at things not just from a gender perspective, but race and class and all of these things, often they fail to appreciate this interconnectedness, this intersectionality that exists, these checks and balances that exist within Islam itself, within the Sharia itself. And it's often due to an individualistic view of looking at things in an isolated manner and not really appreciating the foresight of Islam in preventing certain injustices. So to conclude, feminism is one approach to the matter of women's rights, and Islam has a different approach. They have different bases entirely, to have a different basis, and we shouldn't conflate feminism with Islam and therefore shut out other possibilities or other worldviews that have approaches towards women's rights, including Islam, which has its approach to women's rights. Because unlike feminism, Islam doesn't stop at just justice for one gender. In fact, it doesn't stop at gender. It doesn't stop at gender at all. Rather, it focuses on a holistic balance in society to facilitate the greatest amount of justice by balancing some of these rights and duties. And one of my colleagues aptly put this, but it doesn't promise a utopia. Islam doesn't promise a utopia, but it promises an optopia. In other words, a state of optimal equilibrium between the rights and duties of mankind, such that it minimizes the potential harm and maximizes the ability for people's rights to be fulfilled. My apologies for going on a little bit longer than I had planned. Did not intend that, but thank you so much for listening.
So, thank you very much, Betty, for your talk. I know I myself gained a lot from it. So, we are at 7:30 now, we've just passed, but Zara does have time to answer any questions if we want to do a quick Q&A.
Yeah, I love that. Hey.
Hi, I don't know that much about Islam, so forgive me if I'm
That's fine, that's why we're here.
You're talking about how in Islam they value intellect as an important thing and how women can demonstrate as much intellect as men. I was just wondering, like, what's the reasoning behind there not being that many female imams? Because, or like, if any, I don't know, because obviously it's like a position of respect in community, and that they like demonstrate intellect. So like, I'm just wondering why.
Okay, sure, that's a good question. So the question is, given that Islam doesn't make a differentiation between male and female intellects, why do we not see as many female imams? And there's a couple of presumptions in the question. If you don't mind, I'll unknit those for the rest of the audience. Now, first of all, an imam is someone that leads a prayer. And to put it simply, women can lead the prayer. They lead other women in prayer. So the only reason that we say that women should not lead men in prayer is for modesty reasons, because if women are leading the prayer, I don't know if you ever witnessed women like the Muslim prayer, but there's portions where you have to prostrate and bow down, and effectively that puts your rear end right in the air and at full view of whoever is behind you. So one of the reasons that women are not meant to pray in front of men is for modesty reasons, so that people don't really have like a full view of you from behind. However, women can lead other women in prayer. So for the role of leading prayer, there is no problem in women leading other women, just as there is no problem in men leading other men. The issue with what you said with the Imam being a position of respect or intellect, again, the position of the Imam has changed throughout history. Originally, the Imam not only was the leader of prayer, but also fulfilled like a military duty. So he had like a role as like a significant military function. So the reality is that because Muslim women are not obliged to be involved in the military, although they can if they want to, because it's not an obligation, it's considered unfair to put that burden on women. But the other problem with the question is that we seem to be associating being an Imam with a position of respect, and that respect is somehow something that we can only get from being in a position of prominence or being at the front of something. But again, this comes back to the idea of what I was talking about, which is that putting oneself in the fore of something or putting oneself at the front of something doesn't necessarily mean anything intrinsically. It doesn't make someone a better person or reflect their qualities or skills in any other way. The intellect is, of course, as I said, because a lot of Islam is transmitted by women, we know that intellect is not a reason for that, and this is why women can be judges. Never mind leading the prayer, they can be judges, they can be scholars, they can be lawyers, whatever industry they want to go into. So the Imam doesn't necessarily reflect the idea that there's a difference in intellect, rather it's a function of, a function of prayer, and because women can lead other women in prayer, it's not really like an issue. It is politicized and used differently these days, but it's not really an issue that, for in like the sense of determining whether there's a discrimination of intellect. I hope that helps. Hi.
Hi, Zara. Thanks for your thoughts. I just wanted to ask about the difference between modesty in men and modesty in women. You
Great
mentioned
question.
before about men being able to prostrate at women, but not the opposite way around.
Yeah.
Is it incumbent on women to protect themselves rather than men not to take these thoughts, or is there a distinction there?
There is actually a role on both men and women. So when we talk about modesty, often the misconception is that it's the entire duty of the woman, and that's not the case. So there is, for example, within modesty, both men and women are commanded to lower their gazes. So both men and women have to lower their gazes. It's not something that only men have to do. It's not something that only women have to do. So there is definitely a two-way thing there. With regards to covering their body, both men and women actually have rules as to how much they have to cover. It may be more overt to see women covering because it's different to what you may be used to. But men, for example, they have to cover at least the navel to the knee, and there are some opinions which say they should also, as a minimum, cover the chest. And so for women, there is a different requirement for how much they should cover because of sexual dimorphism. So women tend to be the more attractive of the species, generally, like you see with, in all of the, in the animal kingdom as well, the male and the female, they always have different levels, generally, unless you look at finches, sometimes they look exactly the same as humans. But generally, there is considered to be that women are considered to have the power of beauty in attracting them. And so women are not told that if you pray behind a man, you can sneak a peek. That's not what's happening. It's basically saying that men have a duty to be more respectful because of, women's reputation is considered to be very important. So you're not allowed to slander a woman or create rumours about a woman. And so in the same vein, the woman's honour and her modesty is being protected by, making that distinction. I hope that helps. Hi.
When it comes to Islam,
I'll come back to you after. Yeah, sorry. No, go ahead.
I mean, when it comes to Islam, which Islam are you trying to give us as a model?
Okay, sure.
I mean, which perspective of Islam?
So, again, the question is, which Islam am I talking about? And again, this is based on, and this question comes up a lot, so it's a fair question. But sometimes people imagine that because there are different schools of thought or different types of, different legitimate schools of thought, that somehow these schools of thought are drastically different from each other. And maybe what I'm talking about is a really minority. That's not the case. So basically, even the notoriously, as reported in the papers, the notoriously conflicted Shias and Muslims, even we agree on 95% of what Islam actually is. We agree on all of these things, even to the point that we agree that there should be a Muslim ruler. The only difference is who should be that ruler. That's the only difference. The reality is we actually have a lot more in common than we do that divide us. And a lot of the the stuff about Shia Muslim, a lot of that is political. When you look at Islam itself, it's actually, there's not much that we disagree on. Maybe where we place our hands when we pray, but the major things, the key things, there isn't, the things that I have talked about today are not really contested. So that Islam is Islam, and we shouldn't be afraid to say Islam is. I know it's a postmodern era and everything has to be in quote marks, but Islam isn't one of those things. It is describing itself as being very mubin, which means clear. So the Quran describes itself as being a very clear text. So you have a certain number of verses which are legal verses in the Quran, and they actually are the longest verses of the Quran, and they are very clear in their text, very clear in their meaning, and they're the ones that tell us about how we should live in society. And there are other verses which were revealed in Mecca, which was the early days of Islam, which were revealed in much shorter and poetic styles, to teach people about the oneness of God in a beautiful way that invited them to understand in a language that they did, which was poetry, because the Arabs were a huge fan of poetry. And the Quran has the most eloquent and beautiful poetry. So the Quran makes itself very clear in its purposes, and this is why we don't have major disagreements, as some people may think. Hi, yes.
You talked about the impact of colonization and how it's basically behind all the misconceptions that we have now. Then you gave the example of FGM as a tradition that's inherited from...
Which, sorry?
FGM.
Oh, right.
As an Egyptian tradition that Muslims just inherited. However, I think there's a hadith where the Prophet himself said that you should do this because it pleases the husband.
I don't know. I know what you're talking about. So FGM, we can study through history and through different sources. It originated in ancient Egypt and is practiced by the Christians and animists in that area. And there is a hadith which says that a woman came to the Prophet ﷺ, I'm paraphrasing heavily, and she said, we want to do this. And he was like, if you have to do it, he wasn't saying you should do it, but he was saying if you have to do it, then, don't do it more than this much, and don't make it almost symbolic. This is basically what he was saying. So this is again in the vein of Islam not trying to crush cultures, but trying to say, look, avoid these things. If you're going to do them, don't do it in a harmful way, basically. So this wasn't from Islam, but rather this was one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ was asked to comment on, and he gave his advice on it.
Yeah, but he said the advantages and why you should do it. Until now, actually, in Egypt,
they still do it in Egypt. Yeah.
Muslims do it in Egypt. However, Christians, they don't do it. Or
yeah, I mean, that narration itself, it's not commonly used. I'm not sure if it's a single narration, which is why it's not used as a general rule for all people. This is why lots of Muslims don't do it. But it's definitely something that is regional in that area, where it happens more in certain regions, which tells us about the origins of where it came from. But essentially, unlike male circumcision, it's not something that is generally understood to be something that is required for Muslim women for any reason. But we can talk more about that afterwards if you want, inshallah. Hi.
I was wondering what would you comment on the inheritance part and
Great. Yeah.
the witnesses part?
Absolutely, okay.
Men,
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, and these are really good questions because they come up a lot, with regards to inheritance. Now, based on what I talked about earlier about men being obliged to provide for women, can anyone take a guess as to why men get more than women?
Yeah, I know this course
Yeah.
specific, but the thing is right now in today's society and in today's dynamics, women work as well.
Yeah.
So, and you've mentioned about poverty, and this way, this kind of this kind of division, it doesn't really work with today's dynamics where women and men, they work equally, they provide for the family equally, but then there's still this ruling or this rule that women get less than men, half.
That's a valid question, and I will explain this. So the general rule is that men get more than women because they are obliged to provide for women. Just for anyone that doesn't know, I know you know, because they are obliged to provide for women with that inheritance money. So the wealth that they get, it's not for them to go and buy a Harley Davidson or whatever else. It's for them to actually spend on the women, and often what they get is liquid money. So if you look at the list of people that inherit, you actually have, as primary inheritors, you have more women in that list than men, and women actually inherit before men. So in other words, they tend to get things which relate to the stability of life, so houses, cars, things like that, and men tend to get the liquid wealth, the money, in other words, the things which are the wealth that is there to be spent. So as a general principle, men are supposed to provide for women, that's why they get more. However, in cases of exception, it will be up to a judge, and this has happened many times, but judges can, of course, make a different ruling in a particular scenario, that, okay, in this scenario, you're both working, and therefore, you have to divide it differently, or in such a scenario, it is divided a different way. With inheritance law, it's so specific. You obviously never do it without a judge. This is one of the reasons that having a judge or a judge in place.
It's arbitrary.
No, it's not arbitrary. But the thing is, if we don't maintain that as a general rule, if we don't maintain the fact that men have to provide as a general rule, I'm sorry to say, but men will become lazy. And, over time, the next generations, men will start to forego this duty that they have to provide. They will say, well, the times are different. You go out to work, I'll go out to work, you come home and you clean the house as well. And, I'm still getting, whatever. So this is why if you wash your hands of these principles, we are creating a next generation where these things are no longer in place, where the hardships we are experiencing, we are then handing that down to the next generation because we don't enforce this. There is another point with regards to inheritance. Some people think that the amount of inheritance actually reflects the value of the person. Of course it doesn't, and I hope now that you see why. Similarly, with regards to witnesses, there is this a verse in the Quran which says that in certain circumstances you need 2 female witnesses for every 1 male witness. And some people take this to mean that you always need 2 female witnesses for every 1 male witness, because they claim that Islam considers women to be half of men, or something ridiculous like this. Now, if you look at the verse itself, the first thing it's stipulating is that this is only in, and this was only in at the time, financial transactions, and this was for a reason, and this was because it was not women's obligation to be involved in finance, in industry, business and trade, although many of them were, but because it was not considered their obligation, it was considered unfair to put that burden on women, that they should have the same witness testimony if she wasn't already an expert. If she was an ordinary, not an expert but an expert in something else, it was considered unfair, and in that scenario you would need 2 female witnesses. Now, in other scenarios where women are considered to be more expert, or where they are more likely to have had interaction, so for example, the domains where women may be more likely to be involved, whether that's to do with, witnessing, or for something like a childbirth, or something to do with more what women were expected to be exposed to, in that case you don't need 2 female witnesses. You need 1 female witness, and you may need 2, 3 or 4 male witnesses. Otherwise, in other scenarios, for example, in a disagreement between a husband and a wife, both of their witness testimonies are equal. It's not just because he's a male, his testimony counts as more. In other scenarios, for example, the accusation of fornication, you need 4 male witnesses for 1 female witness. So there are different scenarios in which you need a different number of witnesses, but people like to take the one thing that seems to be very sensational and make misconceptions about it. And it's understandable if they don't know how it actually works. But again, these are things which are brought about in the environment of an Islamic court.
I think this is the only specific one that was mentioned in Quran.
But that verse itself speaks about financial transactions.
Yeah, exactly. I know
Yeah.
that, but the other variations, I haven't heard them in Quran, or
Well, this is
came
because
across them in Quran where women are taken as equal.
This is because it comes from hadith, and also in the Quran, there are many instances in which men and women's testimony is taken as equal. So for example, even something as simple as God saying, the one of you is as the other. The female doer is the same as the male doer. The truthful female, the truthful male, they are one and the same. So there is no difference. The hadith is designed to expand upon the Quran.
Can I just add to that?
Absolutely.
The lady was asking, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting question in terms of, women nowadays earning as well as men. and yet the bill stays the same. Now, from my understanding, which again, correct me if I'm wrong, even though, for instance, I'm working, the money actually belongs to me, and I don't have an obligation to actually use it for the family, whereas the husband, whether they're working, getting a little bit or a lot, the obligation stays the same. So if a woman were to contribute to the family, it actually counts as charity, as opposed to the obligation to provide for the family. So for instance, if the husband earns less, his obligation stays the same to provide for the family, whereas the woman can actually keep all her money if she wanted to. So in a way, I know that...
That's for the husband, actually. Sorry.
Yeah, well, it just means that even if the husband, the male gets more money, the woman who's working doesn't have the obligation to provide. I don't know whether that evens out your...
Yeah, I mean, this is what we talked about earlier as well, and this is how women ended up with the disposable income to do all these other good things with that. Hi.
So I have a question. You talk about poverty a lot, but
Some, not a
countries
lot.
like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
how do they cover poverty?
How do they what?
How do they are included into poverty?
Well, I mean, I mentioned poverty and it's one factor, but it's not everywhere. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. It's definitely not, we know that. In countries, certain countries, they don't still have, even if there's no poverty, there is still sometimes a very large wealth gap, but also the problem with the economic systems. Do you remember I talked about how Islam has a different approach to every single aspect, not just on social, but the economic and the political? Most of those countries still have interest banking, which is not actually the Islamic economic model. The Islamic economic model does not allow interest banking, and it's interest itself which actually causes a lot of the disparity in society and still leads to economic and inequality.
Are not related to banking. Today, the bank doesn't do any women's rights.
I don't understand your question.
Like regulation.
Yeah.
Doesn't have anything to do with women's rights.
Oh, it absolutely does. Because the flow of money in society has everything to do with everybody's rights. If money is being holed up in one area and you have one class of women, for example, that are incredibly rich and another class of women that are incredibly poor, the banking has everything. It all interconnects with each other. Are you saying that money does not affect your life?
It does affect
Absolutely.
life, but it does not affect regulation.
Well, regulation is something, I don't understand what you mean by regulation in this point. When we talk about interest...
Law in general. The law in general.
Law, I think.
The law in general, like law doesn't affect...
No, the law isn't affected by banking.
I think he's trying to say like how women are treated differently in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I think that's why they're treated that way.
No, it doesn't have to do anything with banking.
Yeah, it doesn't, but you were asking about poverty, and I was saying that in Saudi Arabia the problems are not necessarily because of poverty, but because of, yeah, and it's all interconnected. I'm not sure I understand, but maybe we can talk about it a bit more
I'm
after.
from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
The women have the same rights
Yeah.
for the man, including jobs, banking, everything.
Okay, we can talk about that a little bit more after. Maybe I'm not understanding properly. My apologies. Hi, yeah.
I don't know whether it's a question or a comment, but these verses that you're sort of unpicking and telling us what it really means. Do you think that when we first look at them, they look as if they are to the advantage of the male? Do you think that's because in society the patriarchy has given men more power? So these verses being interpreted with a patriarchal interpretation rather than a fair one as Islam would normally.
Well, I think the reality is that we don't study it enough, because actually when we actually look at the views of scholars, a lot of the time, the majority of the time, they're not patriarchal or out to kind of disadvantage women. In fact, there's one scenario in which one woman narrated Hadith, the Prophet ﷺ told this one woman that in her particular case of separation from her husband, in her case, she wasn't entitled to alimony, so she wasn't entitled to upkeep from her husband. And this woman, in her sincerity, narrated this, and she said that when women divorce, they're not entitled to alimony. And other male scholars, who also had legitimate narrations, and Aisha radiallahu anha, specified that her situation was not universal, it was only her situation. And they went out of their way to say, no, women that actually divorce do get alimony, and they, especially if they have kids, And so in that scenario, they could have very easily said, yeah, okay, let's go with that. Yeah, you get nothing because you said the process and said so. So sometimes I think we look at it with this lens because we don't know our books anymore. You remember how I talked about the amputation of our understanding of Islam? And as soon as we start to study Islam, we see these things on the surface. They're not buried that deep at all. But it's just because we don't have that familiarity with it as much at the moment, although that is, growing again. And we do have so many female scholars, even today. You just don't hear about them because they don't want to be out in the forefront. I'm a part of, I'm not a scholar myself, but I was very graciously added to a network of scholars, female scholars. And in this little group, there's like 80, 90 female scholars. It's like, it is just a little WhatsApp group, and they're all, trained and qualified. So there's so many out there, but they just don't feel the need quite correctly, to put themselves on posters. Obviously, we need to find ways to be able to access this resource and to understand our religion better, but we shouldn't just presume that because we don't hear about female scholars that they were never part of it or that they don't exist. And a lot of our misconceptions do come from the fact that we don't know our own, text as familiar as we should. Should we take one more? Okay.
So my question will be a little long.
Okay, it's always the way.
So towards the end, you mentioned that people who ask for power shouldn't be given power because corrupt people tend to gravitate towards power. But what about people who are willing to take on the responsibility that comes with power for a just cause? Aren't people expected to actually take on some kind of responsibility in order to use the power that is intended to be used in a certain way for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
purpose?
So that's a good question. So the question is, if people are not are discouraged from seeking power for themselves, what if people actually want to exercise a sense of responsibility and do something justly for society, like they want to serve society? Now, this impetus to want to serve society and have that responsibility, this is actually something that, I mentioned in the beginning, as Muslims are all meant to be problem solvers. This is something that every single Muslim, regardless of their position in society, should actually be doing. And so, for example, someone that wants to be an advisor, even a woman, if she wants to advise the ruler of a nation, this is something that she can do. If somebody wants to take a position because they have skills and they have the ability, but they don't want authority over people, they just want to be able to contribute what they can, there's no harm in that. And that's actually something that everybody should be doing. The only exception is the role of the leader of the state, the leader of the nation overall. And the reason for that, I'll expand it a little bit more. The leader of the state, one, he gets no special privileges, no special salary. He would actually be paid whatever he was paid in his last job, so only a compensation. He has the burden of actually being accountable for each and every person in society. He doesn't get to decide from his own creativity about how problems should be solved. Others have to advise him, and he has to basically facilitate or just enable that, basically administrate. So he doesn't come up with the rules from himself. He is obliged to consult or shura with those advisors around him. So his position is not necessarily the creative intellect or somebody that is really wanting to do that. Rather, that position is really reserved for every other Muslim in society, and the one at the top is the one that carries the most burden because they are accountable for every little detail. Shall we continue that afterwards, if you don't mind, if there's more? Yeah.